So joining me now, I'd like to welcome in legal analyst and trial attorney, Misty Marris. She's going to talk about both of these high-profile murder trials. So Misty, thank you so much for being with us. I'd like to start with the Chad Daybell case. We just heard from Alex there. What is really most important for both sides when it comes to closing arguments?
So for the closing arguments, it's the roadmap that the jury is going to be looking at when they're in that deliberation room. It's the time for both sides to sum up their case. Of course, in this case, a lot of testimony, a lot of evidence, a lot of forensics for the prosecution. And there is a lot of the prosecution's case is actually circumstantial. It relates to this conspiracy between Lori Vallow, Alex Cox, who was Lori Vallow's brother, and Chad Daybell to commit the murder of JJ and Ty Lee. There's an added piece to this, though, because he's also accused of murdering his wife, Tammy Daybell. So this is kind of a long and complicated summation for the prosecution to go through all of those elements. In addition to that, there's financial crimes such as insurance fraud. So wrapping the jury's mind around that is going to be really important when they begin to deliberate. Now, the defense, on the other hand, they will focus on reasonable doubt. And we know what their case is focused on. You heard a lot about Alex Cox. You heard a lot about Lori Vallow, but you didn't hear as much about Chad Daybell. There's not enough to find that there was a conspiracy. Also, that forensics, they had experts who said that there was not forensic evidence to tie Chad Daybell to JJ and his condition at the time that his body was found. And then lastly, they're going to say that there's no proof that Tammy Daybell was actually murdered and did not die of natural causes. You have to find reasonable doubt. So those are the two polar different arguments that we're going to hear from both sides.
You know, and Alex touched on this at the end of his report there. How much do you think Lori Vallow Daybell's conviction and sentence is looming over this trial?
It certainly is looming, and what the benefit that Chad Daybell got was time to watch Lori Vallow's trial play out, to understand that a lot of the evidence was going to be the same, and to understand how to poke holes in that from a defense perspective. So they did gain that advantage. However, he does face the death penalty. So if he is to be convicted in this guilt phase, there's a whole separate penalty phase, and the jurors actually have to reach a unanimous verdict to have the death penalty be given to Chad Daybell. So that's another important piece where the severity of the case and what's called aggravating factors would actually be argued before the jury a second time. So there's a lot at stake in this case.
There is another case where there's a lot at stake, of course, talking about the murder trial of Christopher Gregor. He's the New Jersey dad charged with murdering his 6-year-old son by forcing him to do those abusive treadmill workouts. You know, yesterday, Misty, we talked to you about this. We thought he would possibly testify. Then we've learned he will not testify. Talk about that decision and what it means as this case moves forward.
So from a defense perspective, it's always going to be a game time decision. The defendant is actually the one that ultimately makes the determination about whether to testify. The lawyers, of course, meet with the defendant, explain the pluses and the minuses to taking the stand. There's a reason why a lot of defendants do not elect to do it, and that's because a whole slew of other evidence can potentially come in to impeach that defendant. And so there's a lot of risk that comes with it. Of course, it's a calculation, and it's a calculated risk. Sometimes testifying may be, and this is what we spoke about yesterday, it may be the Hail Mary. It may be that the jury really needs to hear from this defendant. I believe that when push came to shove and the defense attorneys were meeting with the defendant in this case, they said, you know what, let's focus on the forensic evidence, the failure of prosecutions to reach their burden and not take those risks to testify, and focus on the more technical elements in hopes of raising reasonable doubt or getting a hung jury.
You know, my last question for you, Missy, and I want to talk about some of that testimony. There was a forensic pathologist, well-known forensic pathologist yesterday testifying that the little boy's death, Corey Michiolo's death, was due to sepsis caused by pneumonia. Now, that testimony contradicts the prosecution's expert testimony. How much weight does this testimony potentially carry?
This is what we call battle of the experts. So the defense has presented an expert who's talking about alternate causation to the death of the victim. And in his testimony, he said, number one, the death could have been caused by the actual resuscitation at the hospital. This is something we've heard before in child abuse cases or in general abuse cases. It challenges causation. It's not an uncommon defense, although it's something that's difficult for the jury to swallow, because the jury will say to themselves, well, why is that person in the hospital to begin with? So that's number one. He also said that there was this underlying pneumonia, as you just said, and that other doctors might not have been aware of it, but it existed, and ultimately it was complications that caused his death, and therefore not the alleged abuse. And then the third is that there's actually a child's unexplained death syndrome, similar to SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome, but happens with children. So all of this is to raise reasonable doubt and to contend with the experts and medical examiners who testified for the prosecution. But I got to say, I think when we actually see the jury instructions, when it comes down to causation, it doesn't just stop with that technical what caused the death. It's how did this child get into that hospital bed? And that's something the jury is going to think about. And keep in mind, they've seen the video. Common sense is not left at the door. You go into that jury room utilizing common sense. So we'll see how this comes out. But from a defense perspective, you're looking for a hung jury.
Yeah, so many tough elements in both cases, certainly in this last case. All right, legal analyst, trial attorney Misty Marris, thank you so much.
Thank you.